Hi everybody, my name is Ed Friedman. I'm the chairman of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. Thank you all for coming. We have right now, I think, just one board member here, Tom Walling, steering committee member. We have several one ex-board member, Kathleen right here, active volunteers, Kermit over here, Ruth, somewhere around, Ed, other Ed. If you've got any questions about what we do, please ask. There are a lot of new faces here. As you can see in the back there, we have a lot of these threefold set up that kind of illustrate some of the different areas in which we work. And we are a unique organization in that we do a lot of research, done some work on vegetation in Merrymeeting Bay, land use change over time. We've done a lot of advocacy work. We have involved in 4 lawsuits this summer, mostly around fish passage issues, safe passage of migratory fish, getting up into the rivers and back to the ocean. And we're a land trust, protected well over 1,000 acres of land around the bay. Some of it very much involved with history and archaeology. Do archaeology digs often. And then we have a very active education program in the elementary schools around the bay. So if you're not a member, we encourage you to grab some literature, take a look at the pictures, over some juice and cookies at the end. Ask any of us any questions and maybe you'll join us. We have about over 400 members. And in these times of difficult funding from grantors, it's very nice to have a good membership base. And again, because of the diversity of what we do, membership is critical. And we have a tremendous amount of volunteers. We actually only have 1 paid staff person, and we're between those people right now. So we're working on that right as I speak. But we have maybe 125 active volunteers that get done what we do, and our accomplishments are substantial. So we encourage you to get involved. Even if you're not a member, you may find there's something that we do that you may wish to take part in, whether it's water quality monitoring or whether it's working with kids in schools or coming to a dig. So this series, which runs October through May, costs us well over $800 a year to put on, printing, mailing, all this kind of stuff. Not the money we pay our speaker or our substitute speaker. But one of the ways we help to recoup some of that is Patagonia down in Freeport acts as a sponsor, and they donate a piece of clothing, which tonight is this, and we'll hold it, that's a door prize there. So at the end of the evening, if you'd like to be eligible for that, in this mystery box here, there's a few other boxes. Put your name on a piece of paper, drop it in this box, take your money, drop it in the big box, and then we'll have a drawing at the end of the evening, all right? And our speaker will do that drawing. So I didn't see the paper. I heard, rumor has it there was a press release that we did have a change of speaker. But for those of you that don't know, this is not Chris Groden standing behind me. We're not going to hear about John Allen tonight. Had John Allen not been a successful or not been involved, according to Chris, we'd be looking over at Canada right now. John Allen, actually colonel in the Revolution, was very successful in bringing Native Americans onto the side of the colonies, and in doing so kept the Canadian border where it is now, or was instrumental in keeping it there instead of the Kennebec becoming the border. So Chris basically lives in Belfast and had some major car trouble and couldn't get down here. It would have been like a 2-day bus deal just because of the bus schedule in the winter. And I can't thank Jim behind me enough for being able on short notice to come in here and not only stand in for Chris, but to speak on a not altogether unrelated topic of maritime action during the Revolutionary War. So Jim is a native of Lewiston, and he graduated from UCLA, and it was too hot and sunny down there in California for him. So he, as many good men did, went to sea in a sailing ship. And he spent about 6 years sailing, and then decided it would be easier to write about it. And he's been doing that for years. As many of you know, and maybe some of you have heard Jim speak before, he's won a number of awards on his book. He's written about 16 books on maritime history and maritime fiction. And his book, A Glory in the Name, novel, is winner of the American Library Association William Young Boyd Award for Best Military Fiction. and then his nonfiction George Washington's Navy, about which we'll hear more of tonight, won the Naval Order's Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval History. That's a popular award, right? We've all heard of that before. No, so that's great. So anyway, Jim lives in Harpswell. He's been on TV, Discovery Channel, History Channel, and so forth. And he lives in Harpswell with his wife and kids. And we just had a really enjoyable dinner with him down at Beale Street. It was a lot of fun talking to him. He's working a lot with the Maine Maritime Museum now. And hopefully we'll do some more work together. And with that, a big round for Jim for coming in tonight and sharing.
All right, well, yes, I am your emergency backup speaker tonight. Had there been an actual emergency, you would have been... No, it's a pleasure to be here. I always love talking on the subject, and it's particularly a pleasure to come and talk with friends of Merrymeeting Bay, because as Ed says, I work with the Maine Maritime Museum, and I've been doing a lot more work. We've been getting more involved in the environmental aspect of maritime history, and running day camps that have really focused on the environment of Merrymeeting Bay, the Kennebec estuary. So I've personally been getting much more involved in those subjects recently, so it's a pleasure to come here. With that said, I'm not going to talk anything about any of that stuff. Over the past few years, I've written 3 books which have dealt with the naval action of the American Revolution: Benedict Arnold's Navy, George Washington's Secret Navy, and George Washington's Great Gamble. And I've developed something of a reputation of a George Washington specialist, which I'm really not, though there are some advantages to that. Last year I was invited to come down to Mount Vernon and give a talk, which was very cool. And to make it even cooler, they flew my wife and I down, and they put us up in accommodations on the grounds of Mount Vernon, which was really neat. So I had a little plaque made that said, "Jim Nelson slept here," and I hid it in my room. When I started writing these books, my focus wasn't George Washington. It was really more the naval action in general. But as I started delving into the research, I started realizing more and more how much Washington was absolutely at the epicenter of this. He was so much at the center of all the activity of the American Revolution. It all sort of swirled around Washington. And it becomes inevitable that he becomes sort of the center of these books, just because he was so important in terms of everything that happened in the Revolution. So if there is a theme to these books, to the extent that there is one, it's Washington's growing understanding of the importance of naval power and his learning how important control of the sea was. And this is there's the man himself. This is what we're going to talk about. Washington's learning about naval power is part of the ever-changing and maturing understanding that we have of Washington. You know, when you look at the early histories of Washington, there was this idea that he was sort of born knowing everything. Even as a child, you know, you get these crazy, the Parson Weems stories, and, you know, I cannot tell a lie and all this. There's this sense that Washington was such a great man, such a great leader, that he must have been great as a kid. So you get all these sort of made-up stories about him that we now know are kind of nonsense, but there's still this need, particularly in the post-American Revolution generation, to make Washington something more than a man. Ironically, you see the exact same opposite in the case of Benedict Arnold. I wrote this book about Arnold and delved pretty deeply into his life. And you see, with Arnold, he was so evil as an adult that there was this sort of need to show how he must have been evil as a kid. And so you had all these stories made up about Arnold and how, as a kid, he would put broken glass on the sidewalk so other children would cut their feet, and he'd torture animals and do all this stuff. And none of it's true. It's all made up. We know almost nothing about Arnold's childhood. But again, there's this sort of need to show him that he was always evil, that this evil came from someplace. Same thing with Washington, this sort of reflexive need to show that his brilliance was always there. In the same way, Joseph Ellis, in his biography, His Excellency George Washington, writes, John Marshall, this is Ellis writing, he says, John Marshall, who was one of Washington's first serious biographers, even titled the chapter on Washington's arrival in the world, quote, "The Birth of Mr. Washington," suggesting he was born fully clothed and ready to assume the presidency. You're starting to see now, history's a funny thing. It's very hard to write about history right after it happens. You can't write history when you're still mad about it. Well, that's one of the reasons that, for instance, the biographies of Benedict Arnold, written right after the American Revolution, are so wildly inaccurate with all this made-up stuff, because people were still mad. And they couldn't take a disinterested view of Arnold. Now, some 220 years later, we're calming down a little bit, and we're able to take a more realistic view. And I like to think probably the first historian to do that was our own Kenneth Roberts, who wrote those wonderful novels about Arnold. Roberts was really the first historian to say, okay, his treason was unforgivable, but let's not forget what he did in those early days of the war. So sorry, I'm sort of digressing into Benedict Arnold, which is a favorite topic of mine. I'll get back on track here. But it was the same thing again with Washington in reverse. There's this sort of idolatry of Washington, that he was something more than just a mere mortal. And that, of course, invites a backlash. So you get this revisionist history on the revisionist history that says, well, Washington, he lost more battles than he won. He was really just a rich white slave owner. And that's true. He was. But he also was the indispensable man in the Revolution. So now I think you start to get a more realistic, nuanced view of Washington. Washington made mistakes. He was not perfect. One of the classic mistakes that he made very early in the war was... why can't I ever remember? Battle of Long Island. Whoa. It's going crazy. There we go. Stop. Battle of Long Island in 1776. Washington has his troops up here in New York. He moves them down to this little, village called Brooklyn here on Long Island. The British are landing here. They come ashore at Gray's End. Washington has thousands of troops at the passes here. Thousands of troops here. He's got 5 guys over here. Just 5 guys protecting the left flank of his army. This is an amateur hour mistake. It was not a mistake that the British were going to overlook, and they didn't. The British came in. They reconnoiter, they find out that there's nobody over here, so they lead their whole army around behind Washington's army and just rout them, drive them right out, push them right back into their defenses. Washington's trapped with his back against the river. If he hadn't, Washington was an incredibly lucky guy. And in this case, the wind was blowing from the northeast for 3 days, so the British Navy couldn't get into the East River. It was the only thing that saved him. That could have been the end of the Revolution right there. An amateur mistake. But he learned from it. That was one of Washington's great geniuses. He would learn from his mistakes, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. Some things he never learned. He never learned to make plans that weren't overly complicated. But he did learn. He did develop. That was one of the great things about Washington. And again, a lot of historians have looked at Washington's connection to the Navy and sort of had this idea that Washington always understood the importance of naval power. Washington just sort of innately understood how vital a navy was to winning a war like the Revolution. But as I started getting into these books and started reading Washington's correspondence and seeing his thinking develop, I realized that that wasn't true at all. Washington did not have any real understanding of the importance of naval power. This is one of the real joys of writing books like this, is you start to read the journals, and you read the letters, and slowly the image of the person you're writing about coalesces in your head. I don't know if you've ever played with one of those magic eye things. If you have kids, you've probably... you know what I'm talking about? It's like a bunch of geometric patterns, and you stare at it, and you stare at it long enough, and it resolves into a 3D picture. Is anyone familiar with this? Well, that's kind of what writing history is like. You read the stuff, and slowly these characters become 3D images in front of your eye. It's a real joy. It's the thing that makes it so wonderful. Anyway, when Washington... Okay, I promise I'll stay on topic now. Well, maybe not. When Washington received his commission as Commander-in-Chief in June of 1775, he made a speech to the Congress, and he said, "I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust." He's saying, I may not be up to this job. Now, to some extent, what he's doing is simply what an 18th century gentleman did. You stood up and you said, I don't deserve this. It's like my little old Jewish grandmother. But to some extent, he wasn't lying. He was right. He did not have the experience to do this job. He had never commanded anything larger than a regiment in his life. He didn't have the experience to come over and take command of Commander-in-Chief of an entire army. So he shows up in Cambridge, Massachusetts in June of 1775 as Commander-in-Chief at the head of a 20,000-man army. Now, if this had been a British army, that probably wouldn't have been a problem. The British Army had the discipline, they had the officer corps, they had the protocol in place. It was like a turnkey army. He could have stepped in and taken over. But what Washington finds is he's got a 20,000-man mob. This wild, disorganized, barely disciplined Yankee rabble. Now, Washington hated Yankees. And after he'd been in Massachusetts for a while and gotten to know some of the officers and some of the men, he really hated Yankees. But he also was completely unfamiliar with the type of fighting that they were doing here. Washington's real experience had been fighting in the wilderness. Washington, as a colonel of Virginia militia, had fought mostly in the Ohio Territory and in Western Virginia, wilderness-style fighting. The greatest military moment that he had had prior to the Revolution was when he was accompanying General Braddock on his march against Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh. This is in the French and Indian War. Washington was the only one to realize that the British were marching into an absolute disaster, because the British are marching through the woods, European style, with this massive baggage train behind them. They're marching along. Washington, who was trained in woodland style fighting, knew that this was going to be a disaster. Washington suggests sending a flying column ahead that could move faster than Braddock's army to try to clear the way in front of them. It was one of the only things that Braddock did right, but it still didn't save them. Finally, at the Monongahela River, as Braddock was trying to move his entire army across the river, they're ambushed by the French and Indians, who surprise them and catch them completely off guard. The British redcoats did what redcoats were trained to do. They stood there in their straight lines with their red coats with "shoot me" written across their chest, and they were shot. Washington's men were the only ones that ran into the woods and fought the enemy the way the enemy was fighting, woodland-style fighting, the type of guerrilla fighting that the Indians had taught the French. And this is what Washington was good at. This is what he had trained his men to do. But it had nothing to do with the kind of warfare he would be fighting on the East Coast. You know, there's this idea that a lot of Americans have that the British throughout the war stood in their perfect lines while the Americans hid behind trees and walls and shot at them like that. And it's not true. That happened at Lexington and Concord, and I think that's where that myth comes from. But Americans didn't fight that way. Americans fought the way the British did. I think part of the problem is that it just seems so absurd, the idea of standing there in a line and just shooting at another line of guys, that we as Americans don't like to think that we would do something that dumb. But that was just the way they fought wars back then. When you've got these wildly inaccurate muskets that you're using, it really is the only sort of effective way of fighting. So anyway, Washington was used to this kind of warfare. He was not used to the kind of warfare that he would meet on the West or on the East Coast, like this, again. The soldiers standing in ranks and firing. Now, when Washington came to Cambridge, he also encountered something else that he had never dealt with before, that was utterly foreign to him, and that was the sea. He had never had to think of the sea on a strategic level. Like I said, his fighting had been in the wilderness, in the woods. He'd never had to think about naval tactics and how the sea plays in with what he's doing. He'd only taken one voyage to sea in his entire life, in 1751, when he went with his brother to Barbados. And the only thing memorable that happened on that trip was that Washington got smallpox, and obviously survived it. But it ended up being a very good thing, because of course living through smallpox gives you an immunity to it. And thousands and thousands of men in the Revolution died of smallpox, but Washington had that immunity. So that was the only good thing that had happened. Washington actually, as a young man, wanted to join the British Navy as a midshipman. He was ready to go. He was ready to sign up. His mother wrote to her brother in London, who was fairly well connected, and asked if this was a good idea that George be a midshipman in the Navy. And her brother said, no. He doesn't want to do that. That's, in the Army, the only way to advance, you had to literally buy your commission to advance up the ranks. The Navy wasn't quite that bad, but you still weren't going to get anywhere in the Navy unless you had connections, and Washington had none. So his uncle basically talked him out of joining the Navy, luckily for us. So Washington knew nothing about naval affairs, but when he comes to Boston, he finds himself surrounded by water. This is a map of Boston in 1775. I don't know if there's any city in America that is more radically different today than it was 200 years ago than Boston. You can see this is Boston proper here. It was essentially an island in 1775, just connected by this little strip of land at Roxbury. This is what we call the North End today of Boston. The aquarium's right about here. Of course, the Charles River is just very narrow. Now it's all filled in. Logan Airport's over here. Looks very, very different. But when Washington shows up, he finds the American Army basically circling Boston like this, completely cutting the city off from land, but the sea lanes are completely open. So here's Washington trying to starve the British out of Boston, and he realizes as long as the sea lanes are open, he's never going to be able to cut them off, because they can always resupply from sea. Washington figured there's nothing he could do about it. Again, because he didn't understand naval affairs. He figured he was just stuck. Luckily for Washington, he had a lot of officers in his headquarters who were Yankees, who really understood the sea. Foremost among them was John Glover from Marblehead. And Glover, we think it was probably Glover, went to Washington and said, look, you know, you don't need, in Washington's mind, that's what a Navy looked like, you know. And he knew he wasn't going to get this. He knew there was no way the Americans were going to build this, so he figured he was stuck. Glover goes to Washington and says, look, you don't need ships like this. You don't need ships of the line and frigates and all these things. These are just unarmed merchant ships. All you need to capture them are a couple of schooners with a few cannons on them. And I just happen to have one I can rent you, he said. So sure enough, John Glover rents George Washington his first schooner, and Washington puts guns on it. And as soon as Washington understands this idea, that he can go out and start capturing these unarmed merchant ships with just these little schooners, he completely embraces the idea and starts working furiously to create this little fleet of men of war. This is sort of his first introduction into the importance of sea power. Now Washington, as much as he loved this idea, knew that the Continental Congress was not going to go for it, for a couple of reasons. One, the southern colonies were not interested in a navy. They knew that any navy was going to be built by Yankees, it was going to be crewed by Yankees, officered by Yankees, and it was going to be protecting Yankee shipping. And they didn't see a lot of benefit in it to them, even though they would have to pay for it. Navies are very expensive. To put a soldier in the field in 1776, all you really needed was a musket and the accoutrements. They didn't even, for the most part, have uniforms. You know, they say to be a soldier at that time, all you needed was to be able to march, to be able to handle your musket, and to have at least 2 opposing teeth so you could bite the top off a paper cartridge. That was all you needed. Ships were very different. You needed trained sailors on board ships. You needed food, you needed gunpowder, you needed guns, you needed all this stuff. Navies are very expensive. The other reason the Congress was not for it, and it's a little more of a subtle concern, but in 1775, at the beginning of the Revolution, most people were not willing to say that they were fighting for independence. It took a full year until the Declaration of Independence came along that most Americans were willing to say, yes, what we want is independence. At the outbreak of the Revolution, most people didn't really feel that way. They were fighting for their rights, they were fighting for a certain degree of sovereignty, but they didn't necessarily want to be independent. Now, as long as you just have an army in the field, you can say, hey, this is just the militia defending our homeland. But only sovereign nations send ships out on the high seas to attack enemy shipping. Creating a navy was tantamount to a declaration of sovereignty, and a lot of people were not willing to go that far. Washington understood all this. He knew that the Congress would not go for a navy. So he created his little navy without bothering to tell anyone about it. And that actually is the subject of the second book in this trilogy, George Washington's Secret Navy. So Washington gets his little fleet of schooners, sends them out to attack British shipping coming into Boston. They are very effective, despite a lot of extraordinary incompetence at the very beginning. And again, this is the incredible thing about Washington, because his little navy was a disaster at the start, but he never gave up. He kept trying, and he kept trying, and finally he got the right officers, he got the right crews, and they started really effectively snatching up British shipping, depriving the British Army in Boston of supplies, and bringing it to his army. In late November of 1775, John Manley, one of his captains in one of these little schooners called the Lee, captures an ordnance brig called the Nancy, which was loaded to the gunnels with military stores. It was exactly what they needed. You know, thousands of muskets and cartridges and flints and guns and carriages and everything they needed stuffed into this one little ship. They took it from the British and brought it in. So Washington's little navy is very effective for that year that Washington has got the British bottled up in Boston. Finally, in the spring of 1776, Washington mounts cannons on Dorchester Heights, makes Boston untenable for the British, so they evacuate the city. They get in their ships and they sail away. And Washington once again gets a lesson in the importance of naval power when the British load on board their ships and they disappear over the horizon. And Washington realizes he's got no idea where they're going. They can go anywhere because they've got naval power. They can move by sea. Washington guesses that they're headed for New York City, and of course he's right. They go to Canada first, and then come down to New York. In June of 1776, they arrive off New York City. Hundreds of British men of war and transports, just an absolute forest of masts in New York Harbor. It was the biggest fleet that Washington had ever seen, because it was the biggest expeditionary force ever sent to America. Again, just an incredible display of British sea power. And, Washington looking at this and realizing there's virtually nothing he can do to stop it. The British can strike anywhere they want, anywhere along the Hudson River. This massive men of war that they had. And it's only a fluke that the winds, like I said, after the Battle of Long Island, it was only a fluke that the wind kept the fleets out of the East River and kept them from destroying Washington after that. So, for a year, the British chased Washington around New York, New Jersey, and then they get tired of it, and once again, the sea power comes into play, where Lord Howe loads his army on board the fleet of ships, and once again, they disappear over the horizon. And Washington's got no idea where they're going. They, once again, can strike anywhere, from Georgia to Maine. They've got complete freedom of movement because they control the sea. It turns out in this case, Howe was heading for Philadelphia. And, for months and months, the Americans had been fortifying Delaware Bay, putting underwater obstructions, building forts, doing all these things to try to stop the British from coming up the bay. Didn't do a bit of good. The British just swept them aside and came in and took Philadelphia. Again, because sea power could project power anywhere that the British wanted it in a way that Washington had no way of countering. Now, in October of 1775, the Continental Congress had actually created a United States Navy. And despite Washington's growing understanding for the need for sea power, Washington was actually not a big fan of the Navy, because he realized that the Americans could never build anything that could really counter the British Navy. They could never build anything big enough to really fight the Royal Navy. And he figured if they couldn't do that, they might as well not do anything, because it was just a waste of supplies. Was he right? I don't know, he might have been. The U.S. Navy certainly did some good during the Revolution. It was effective in a lot of ways, but it was never a real threat to the British Navy, certainly. So that's kind of an open question, historically, whether the U.S. Navy during the Revolution really did any good at all. Now, Washington, as I said, all he could do was stand on shore and watch the British Navy projecting their power wherever they wanted through the use of their Navy, through what he called their canvas wings. And he was constantly sending out warnings as the fleet went out. The British are out, we don't know where they're going, but be careful, because they could come anywhere. Finally, in 1777, in part because of this extraordinary naval action that Benedict Arnold staged on Lake Champlain the year before, everything changes. General Burgoyne is captured at Saratoga. And the French, who have been sort of secretly helping the Americans all along, suddenly realize, mon Dieu, the Americans, they could win. They never agreed to anyone. We might win the war. And suddenly when the French realized, wow, they might win, they came in on the side of the Americans. And suddenly, Washington had access to a real fleet. The French fleet now was there at his disposal. this changed everything. When we think of the British fleet, the British Navy, we're so influenced by, Horatio Nelson and Horatio Hornblower and Patrick O'Brien, and we think of the British Navy as being absolutely unbeatable. And certainly by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that was true. During the Revolution, the French Navy was a lot closer match to the British Navy. It was not inevitable that the British Navy was going to defeat the French. So Washington had real reason to hope when the French came in and he realized he had access to this naval power. And Washington writes to the Comte de Vergennes, who was the French foreign minister in Versailles, right after the French come into the war, he writes to him and says, "Next to a loan of money, a constant naval superiority on these coasts is the object most interesting. This would instantly reduce the enemy to a difficult defensive, and by removing all prospects of extending their acquisitions, would take away their motives for prosecuting the war." See, the first thing that Washington wants is a fleet. Because by this point, in 1777, he has come to realize that he can fight forever and never lose. But he's not going to win the war unless he has naval superiority, unless he controls the water. So those are the two things that he wants from the French. He wants money and he wants ships. He absolutely does not want any more French officers. He's got plenty of those, and he can't stand any of them, with the exception of the Marquis de Lafayette and a couple of others. Ships and money, that's what he wants. Now, it's kind of a two-edged sword for Washington, because on the one hand, he has access to the fleet. It's there for him, but he has no control over it. The French fleet comes to America when the French fleet wants to come to America, and they don't do what Washington tells them. He can make suggestions, and sometimes they do it, and sometimes they don't. And so for a couple of years, 1778, 79, Washington has one disappointment after another as the French fleet under the Compton Sting comes to America and basically bones up in Savannah. They go to New York, they bone things up there. They're unable to actually give any real assistance to Washington. But again, one of Washington's great attributes is that perseverance. He doesn't give up. He doesn't lose hope. When any sane human being would have just thrown in the towel years earlier, Washington just keeps plugging along, waiting for that moment. And sure enough, finally it comes. In July of 1780, almost 2 years to the day after the French declared war on England, a French army of 4,000 men under the Comte de Rochambeau, along with 9 ships, arrives in Newport. Now you think, 2 years? It took them 2 years after the declaration of war to actually get over here and do something? And it does seem like an extraordinarily long time. One of the things, Americans have a very different perspective on the Revolution than the rest of the world. To us, the American Revolution was a battle that took place in the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of the United States, which it was in the first couple of years of the war. But after the French got into it, it became a world war. There was fighting in the West Indies, in France, in England, in India, in Africa. They were fighting everywhere. And America actually became something of a sideshow in the war. Most Americans would be surprised to realize that after France got in the war, King George considered just abandoning the colonies. The heck with them. We were like the least important part of the whole thing. There was virtually nothing that we produced here in America that they couldn't produce in England, with the possible exception of tobacco and rice. What was really valuable to them were the West Indies, the sugar islands. That's where the big money was. That's what they were most concerned about. And frankly, that's a big reason that the French came in on our side, is that they were hoping to scoop up some of those valuable islands in the West Indies. The French were not very motivated by the idea of helping a popular uprising to overthrow the shackles of monarchy. This was not an example they really wanted to set. And of course, it would come back to bite them in the rear end, 20 years later. So the French Navy concentrated on the West Indies. They came to the United States when they were able to. But now, for the first time, in 1780, you had 9 French ships of the line actually stationed here in America. And these ships were much more at Washington's disposal. Now, Rochambeau, the French commander, was really ideal in a lot of ways. He was a very experienced officer, very diplomatic, which was not always the case with the French aristocracy, and very willing to let Washington take the lead. He was willing to understand that he was subservient to Washington. However, he was not going to just sacrifice his men. His first concern was making sure that his army was okay. And when Rochambeau shows up and he sees the American army, he can't believe it. It's like they're in rags. They've got no discipline. Their guns are falling apart. He's just shocked. And he writes back to Versailles and he says, we can't count on these Americans at all. Washington is completely fudging the numbers in terms of how many men he has under arms. Washington keeps saying, how many soldiers do you have? And Washington keeps saying, well, in the spring we're going to have a lot. Just wait. So Rochambeau is just horrified. But Washington, again, his focus is on the ships. And when Rochambeau shows up, Washington, the first letter that he writes to him, he says, in any operations, under all circumstances, a decisive naval superiority is to be considered a fundamental principle and the basis on which every hope of success must ultimately depend. Washington has come to the point where he recognizes that the Navy is tantamount. That is the most important thing. Now, Washington was obsessed with New York City. For 2 years, he'd been camped outside of New York, and all he could think about was taking New York. Rochambeau realized that New York was a loser. The British had had 2 years to fortify the city. The French ships couldn't get in over the bar. There was virtually no way to take New York. Rochambeau starts looking towards the Chesapeake and realizes that that's where the real vulnerability is. Sir Henry Clinton was the British commander-in-chief at this time. He was in New York, but he understood the importance of the Chesapeake, and he understood the vulnerability too. He said, I have always been sensible to the very great importance of operations in the Chesapeake, though I am aware they are attended with great risk, unless we are sure of a permanent superiority at sea. So you get the situation developing down in Virginia. Like I said, Washington is focused on New York. But there's a British general down in Virginia who's wreaking havoc. And Washington thinks, if we can just trap this guy between the sea and an American army, we can capture him. And we have a French fleet that can go down and trap him. Now, people who are into American history would think I'm talking about Charles Cornwallis. But actually, the British general that Washington was so eager to capture was Brigadier General Benedict Arnold, who had gone over to the other side and been sent down to Virginia as a British officer. Historians say that Arnold was the best officer on either side of the American Revolution. And here he was. So Washington has this opportunity. He sends Lafayette down with instructions to trap Arnold. If you capture him, he is not to be treated like a prisoner of war. He's to be hanged immediately. No questions asked, no trial, no nothing. Just hang him. They send the French fleet down to try to cut off Arnold's escape by sea. As it happens, the French and the British fleets meet in a naval battle called the Battle of Cape Henry. The French win, but they decide to go home anyway. So they leave the British in control of the Chesapeake, go back to New York, Arnold escapes. But it's a perfect dress rehearsal for what's going to happen 4 months later when Charles Cornwallis goes to Yorktown and finds himself trapped with his back to the sea, an American army in front of him, and the only possible saving grace is the British Navy that's going to come and rescue him. Well, in this case, Rochambeau has written to the French admiral, a guy named de Grasse, and said, come to the Chesapeake. Now is our chance. We have got these guys if you just show up now. De Grasse does an incredible thing, something that nobody expected. Everyone figured that when he came, he'd bring about 19 of his ships, which the British figured that they could deal with. But he doesn't. He throws the dice and brings his entire fleet of 32 ships of the line to the Chesapeake. It's an overwhelming force. Here's Rochambeau and de Grasse, the French admiral. They show up. I won't go into the details of the battle. It's all in the book. George Washington's Great Gamble. Did I mention what excellent Christmas presents signed books make? But Rochambeau shows up with this massive fleet, defeats the English at the Battle of the Capes, and Cornwallis is trapped between an American army and the French fleet, and he surrenders his army at Yorktown. And though they don't realize it at the time, it is the end of the American Revolution. So Washington has gone from knowing nothing of the Navy to understanding that the Navy is critically important to winning the Revolution, to finally this one bright, shining moment where he actually has command of the sea. And he wins the Revolution with it, just as he understood that he would, by controlling the sea. Washington, after Cornwallis' surrender, went on board the Ville de Paris, which was de Grasse's flagship, to meet the French admiral for the first time. The Ville de Paris was the biggest ship that Washington had ever set foot on. It was one of the biggest ships in the world at the time. And Washington comes on to meet de Grasse. Now, Washington, of course, was a big man. He was, 6'2". John Adams, who was always very jealous of Washington, once said that the only reason Washington got picked for everything is because he was the tallest guy in the room. But Washington was a big man. But de Grasse was huge. De Grasse was like 6'6" and weighed 300 pounds. He was like a bear. And the story goes that when Washington came on board the flagship and met de Grasse for the first time, de Grasse came over and threw his arms around Washington and yelled, "Mon cher petit général." And certainly if that happened, then like American control of the sea, that was the first and last time it ever happened during the Revolution. So that's all I have to say. If anyone has any questions, I would love to make something up. Thank you. Yes?
In which order did you write the book?
Benedict Arnold's Navy was first, and then George Washington's Secret Navy, and then George Washington's Great Gamble. And it really didn't start out to be a trilogy. It was really, as I was writing the last one, my editor said, "Hey, this kind of works like a trilogy." And I realized, oh yeah, it does, doesn't it? So, yeah.
Is the George Clinton, the British officer you mentioned?
Henry Clinton.
Oh, Henry Clinton. Okay, no, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of George Clinton in New York, who was governor.
Oh, the governor, yeah.
I wondered if they were...
No. I forget what happened to Henry Clinton. He went back to England and continued on his career. The revolution ruined a lot of careers, but I think his managed to remain intact.
Where was your source of materials? I read the Secret Navy, and I'm halfway through Benedict Arnold.
Oh.
Where did you find the letters and all of the communications between these people?
It really varies. For Benedict Arnold's Navy, the best, so it's a matter of sort of finding where the stuff is located. That's sort of the first step. With Benedict Arnold's Navy, most of the good stuff is at the Pell Thompson Research Library at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. They've really got just a treasure trove of stuff. So I went there and spent a lot of time researching. Some things like George Washington's correspondence has all been published. Right now, the University of North Carolina is doing a new version of Washington's correspondence, which is absolutely wonderful. So you can I go to the Bowdoin Library and you can actually check out volumes of his letters. And they're beautifully footnoted, and they got all the correct crazy spellings and the capitalizations. So that was an important source. A lot of times you can find this stuff published. Most of Lafayette's correspondence has been published. The British correspondence you can usually get your hands on. Sometimes you have to actually find the archives where it is. And it's kind of a mixed blessing. I spent a lot of time in the National Archives in Washington. Library of Congress has got a lot of stuff. It's kind of a mixed blessing when you get something like Washington's correspondence published. It's great because you've got it in a book form. It's easy to read. You can have it on your desk. But there's no pleasure quite like holding that original document in your hand. That is just such a thrill. So like at Ticonderoga, most of what I needed had been published, or printed in some manner. But I read a number of like Benedict Arnold's original correspondence. Just to think, to hold that, think, Benedict Arnold held this. Or the same thing, with Washington, to hold this, think of Washington physically held this paper. I've held it. It's just such a thrill. But for better or worse, you do less of that. The internet, actually, I find every book I write, the internet becomes a more helpful source. For instance, Library of Congress has scanned all of Washington's correspondence. So you can actually go on and see the letter in the original handwriting online. So that sort of thing is very valuable too. But it really varies. And that's really the biggest trick with these books is finding where all the stuff is. Yes?
The Scooterboat captains that you mentioned, like Manly, receive a percentage of the spoils.
Yes.
In your view, were they patriots who happened to enjoy the profit, or were they real profiteers who used patriotism for their own gain?
Well, that's a good question. In their case, I would say they were definitely patriots. In every Navy at the time, there was a system of prize money. When a ship captured an enemy ship, the crew got a certain percentage of whatever was sold. Part of that is because service at sea was so miserable, you just couldn't get people to do it without that. But that's different from privateering. And this is it's a common mistake, but in times of war, right up to the American Civil War, you had what were called privateers. And that was, the government would issue a paper called a letter of marque and reprisal. And any citizen could get a letter of marque and reprisal, and it gave them permission to arm a ship and go out and attack enemy shipping. In fact, if you read the United States Constitution, I think it's Article 8, Section 3, the Congress still has the right to issue letters of marque and reprisal. In fact, I have an application currently pending. But the privateers were a lot more questionable. Manly and these guys were commissioned U.S. Army officers. The privateers were private citizens, and they really were doing it for profit. And the fact that it happened to help the United States was kind of, ancillary. So I would say Washington's guys, they were pretty well motivated out of patriotism like any soldier, but the privateers were a lot more questionable. So, yes?
I thought Robert Morris sort of ran the Navy.
Yeah.
How does that interact with your books and
what happened was at the onset of the Navy, you had the Naval Committee that sort of ran things. And that kind of fell apart. And you had different naval commissions in different ports that ran things. And then as the Navy kind of went by the wayside, Robert Morris started to take over. So by the end of the war, yes, he really was running the whole show. But that was the American Navy. In George Washington's secret Navy, which really ends in 1776, Robert Morris hadn't come to the forefront yet. And in George Washington's Great Gamble, I'm really talking mostly about the French Navy. So it just happens that none of my books have overlapped when Morris was running things. But yes, he was instrumental in running the Navy, particularly toward the end of the war. He was the only one who would put up with it at that point. Yes?
The gondola that they just launched down here in Portsmouth, or wherever it was that similar to the gondolas that Benedict Arnold had?
It was. In a lot of ways it was. The one in Portsmouth is a lot longer and narrower, but it's similar in that it's a very boxy kind of vessel, very shallow draft, one single lateen sail. There's actually, if you ever get a chance to go to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in Virginia, Vermont, which is a great maritime museum, and they've built an exact replica of one of Arnold's gunboats. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, particularly when you realize that there were 45 guys living on this thing. It's just unbelievable. So. All right, well, there's no one else. I thank you very much. And like I said, I have books if anyone would like them. Okay.
Not too many people, they put money in the box, and
Okay.
odds are good. I want to remind everybody, next month, December, what? Anyone remember? I have the card in front of me. January, this is December, thank you, that's a good start. Second Tuesday in January, more or less.
The winner is Jim Nelson. Just kidding. No. Christopher Sewell.
So you have someone?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I did put you in there, too.
Oh, did you really? Oh, right.
Yeah, January 11th, our annual meeting, short business meeting, like 15 minutes, and potluck supper, which is always great. Potluck supper starts at 6, our speaker starts at 7. It'll be over in the Cram Alumni Building at Bowdoin College, which is the second to last building on Federal Street from the Bath Road going down. And our speaker is Terry Hardy, good friend, eco-historian, activist, very much a river restoration activist, author of the book Notes from a Lost Flute, all about Indian place names in Maine. So it should be a really wonderful evening, and hope you can come too.
Absolutely.
So that's January 11th. Thank you. Cookies and juice over there, and thank you to Jim.
Thank you. That was a total accident, but I picked you. It was.